Hello and welcome to episode 308 of the Money to the Masses podcast with your resident expert as always, Damien Fay, and me, Andy Leaks. Damien, welcome back. How are you doing?
I'm quite ecstatic this week, Andy. Energised, in fact, because this week saw the 11th birthday of Money to the Masses, which is quite a feat. We've been around for 11 years and we laughed in the office, didn't we? Well, we weren't in the office, we're talking remotely, but it nearly did pass us by without recognition. That's how much we've been heads down. It wasn't until somebody, it was Justin, in fact, said, "Oh, do you realise it's our birthday today?" So, yeah, Money to the Masses is 11 years old. So it's been a long journey since the early days when I first started this, when it was me typing blog posts in the evenings after my daytime job and just doing the first ever post, which was around saving tax on your savings each day, plodding along in the evenings when my daughter was the world's worst sleeping baby. And it's been a long road, which I've talked about before, to the point where after 4 years, I then began working on it full time. And then where we continued growing podcasts, you, Andy, coming to work for us, having a team, offices, and we help, about 3 million people a year on the website. We've had about 1.5 million downloads on the podcast, the MOT and 80/20 investor. I mean, it's been an incredible journey, which I am very proud of. But yeah, just pat ourselves on the back and celebrate our birthday.
Yeah, it was kind of weird that we forgot about it. Like you say, we've had our heads down, but something good did come out of that because you're going to tie that in with something we're talking about in the podcast today. So what is it we've got coming up on the pod?
So one of the pieces I want to talk about is the 10 business essentials. So this isn't a complete list. This is just some thoughts on things that people should get in place or do when they're starting out in business. So Money to the Masses has been around as an entity for 11 years. As a business, it's been around for about 7 in terms of when I was working on it full time. But all of this feeds into the idea of what you need to do to be able to make something or increase the chances of making something successful, because there'll be lots of people who are listening to this podcast who will be thinking about starting a business or are in the early stages of starting a business. After a recession like we've had, it's normally a real peak time for people starting out on their own and starting their own businesses. So I just want to pass on some lessons that I've learned in running my own business. The other thing I want to talk about is margin of error. I'll explain that in more detail at the end of the podcast. And the other meaty piece, Andy, is one that you're going to do relating to pensions.
Yeah, I'm going to be doing a piece on Nest, which is the government-backed defined contribution auto-enrolment service. And it's been going for a few years now. It's actually the largest pension provider in the UK. And doing some of my research, we've had lots of questions from people asking, how does it work? They've been enrolled. Can they opt out? So I'm going to go over all the questions that you've got in terms of transferring out, transferring in, whether you can opt out, and the costs and things like that.
Great. So I'm going to kick off with the business piece. So as I said, these are some pointers to help people who may be starting out on a business or thinking about starting a business. Now, like I said, the journey for Money to the Masses has been a long one. And what happens, most people think that businesses suddenly become successful, or when they first hear about them, that the journey has been very quick. Often it isn't. It's a long journey. To get to the point where you start to become known or have success. And the lessons are the things that you probably want to bear in mind at the start. So the first one I want to throw out there is act like a company from day one. So that means even if you haven't got customers as such, if you haven't got premises, whatever your business is, start to run it like a company. So that can mean recording everything, filing things away in a drive online. That means having board meetings if you're going to have directors of the company. So to give you an example, when we started Money to the Masses, and it was just a blog, and we had the idea that we're going to keep continuing this, and it was gaining traction, and it wasn't a fully fledged business at that point in terms of me working on it. I recall Justin and I having a meeting about what was going on and about the business or Money to the Masses as an entity. So we did that early on, like from the start. And the reason it's good is because it gets you into the right mindset of how things should be run. So doing things properly from the very beginning and documenting the journey that you're on as well. And so you can make decisions, because one of the things is at the beginning, there can be lots of decisions you make that you'll come back to later and wonder, why did I do that? Why did we set it up like this? And it's very useful to have those decisions documented down, because otherwise you go round in circles trying to work out why did you do something in a particular way. So act like a company from day one, have meetings, make meeting notes, keep records. The other thing is that I know what happens when we want to try and do something new. We get excited about what we're going to call it. So we might decide what the business is, or what it's going to do, whether it's haircuts or doing something online, and we come up with a name that we fall in love with for whatever reason. And the thing I want people to bear in mind is that if their business becomes successful further down the line, they may get to a point where they will want to trademark their name. And the reason why you might want to trademark your company name, for example, is that you've built up a lot of brand equity. So your brand is well known for whatever it is it does. And if you own a trademark to your name, then it can stop other people registering that particular name for their businesses as a trademark. But it can mean that you have some form of recourse, ability to challenge people who want to use the same name or something very close to it to ride off the back of your brand equity. It will vary. For example, if you were deciding to do like a local barber shop in a particular area that's quite niche, then the power of your name might not be so important because of the type of business it is and the type of customers and how you attract them. It might not matter so much that you will have ownership of the name itself. But as you grow, you may want to own that trademark. And what happens numerous times is that people get to the point where they want to trademark it because they've been doing something for a very long time. They've become well known for it, that they may try and trademark it. And actually, it's relatively cheap to apply for a trademark yourself. It costs around about £500. But you can then suddenly find when you go to do it, it could be challenged and you might not be able to trademark that name because you may have picked a word, for example, that's a commonly used word or something that might be a turn of phrase or something like that. And that can be very difficult to trademark. Or there could be somebody else out there with the existing trademark already. And so what would happen is you would then have to change your company name if you wanted to try and trademark it going forward. So it's worth thinking about that when you make a name for your company and you create it, do a bit of research, find out about the sorts of names you won't be able to use. So like when I say use, I mean trademark. To give you an example, if you think about the company called Game, they don't own the word game, otherwise people wouldn't be able to use the word, but they own the logo and the way it's written, the text. So you can trademark a word, but you can trademark the style of it, the style of the logo. So there's lots of things you can trademark around that people will recognize as you. So for example, when you see certain types of writing, you've probably done the quiz, a bit of fun online, and there's been words written in a slightly different, like a given word that's written in a style, and you have to name the brand that it is. And it could be like the style of Coca-Cola, but a different word. Those sorts of things, that style can be trademarked. Your word, your name written in a particular style can be trademarked. It's something to bear in mind. And it's one of the reasons why a lot of tech companies make words up. So Facebook was not a word. It didn't exist as a word. It's far easier to trademark a word that doesn't exist than it is one that does. So you'll know there's not going to be a competitor that's already done it, and you'll probably find you can trademark it very, very easily. Of course, you can get a lawyer involved if you have problems, but that becomes very expensive. And it's the other reason why you see people make up words, not just like Facebook, but they might create a word that's got numbers in it or something like that. So that's why all the fintech companies you see have quirky spellings of their name, because they know they can trademark it. So the other thing you've got to do is make sure that you are registered with HMRC and Companies House. So you will have decided whether you're going to be a sole trader or a limited company, but you've got to make sure that things are registered properly. One thing I would add is that get a good accountant if you can afford it. Now, accountants aren't ridiculously expensive, but they can make sure that you file your appropriate amounts of tax and pay it. You might have to be on top of them, but it varies on accountants. Get a recommendation, and the same goes for a solicitor. So they can help you, not just in legal disputes or in terms of filing your accounts and managing your books, but they are great sources of advice. So if you're at a company and you want to go and buy, let's say, a new digger, then you could go to your accountant and ask their advice. They may have ways that you can fund that purchase, or maybe it's whether there's grants or tax reliefs and things like that. So they are a means of being able to help you in your business and help grow it. So get a good accountant. If you can't afford an accountant, but even if you do actually afford an accountant, using some of the accounting software that Andy spoke about last week. They're fantastic. They give you a lot of power and they are very useful in being able to not only run your own finances and books for your company, but even if you have an accountant, then they can work seamlessly with them. The other thing I would say is insurances. People always overlook the boring when they get started. So that could be public liability insurances. It could be something like cyber security insurance. So if your company gets hacked and there's a data leak, the fallout of that insurance can help you cope with that. Other things are key man insurance. So if you get employees on board, you might want to insure them so that if they were to get hit by a bus, that you'd be able to have the money to replace them. Because when you're small, each individual employee is very important. Equally, if you've got shareholders in a business, you've got other directors, you will want to look at shareholder protection, because you could get to the point where you go further down the line. Again, if something unfortunate were to happen to one of the other directors, you could get to the point where their share of a company, you are unable to buy it because you haven't got the funds. You want to sort all of that out. So what happens if somebody were to die? These things people don't think about. They tend to get too excited about growing their business, but they're things that we should think about in the early days. Low cost infrastructure is the other thing that scales. So by that, I mean using things like Zoom, maybe Google Workplace, Microsoft Teams. There's lots of infrastructure that you can use out there that is free or very cheap, and it doesn't cost much when you scale it. So when you get each employee or use more of it, then the cost can go up. That low cost infrastructure will be key if you want to try and grow a business over time. So you don't need to go out, for example, and pay loads of money to have servers or loads of money for capital expenditure. When you can try and use something like maybe Google Workplace, you can work from home, you can have a team spread across the country, and it reduces your overhead. So always look for low cost infrastructure. There's loads of it out there, and it allows you to compete with companies that are perhaps bigger than you. The other thing is outsourcing and automation. Whatever your business is, you don't have to always employ somebody to be able to grow. So they may have an expertise that you acquire. It doesn't need to be in-house. You could outsource that expertise. Maybe it's development of a website. Maybe it's something else, logistics. You could outsource that. And there's a point where that's very cost effective because you don't have to bring the expertise in-house, pay for it, have the liability of paying for that. You can use what you need and you can therefore manage that cost ongoing, but it enables you to grow. And the other big thing I would say to people is always try and automate. So the lessons that we've learned over the years, and it's all vary from different businesses, but can you automate anything? And always review and try and automate, because if you automate something, it not only reduces the cost, but it means the process is being done without the need for having to spend more money to employ someone to do it, but it also means it can scale. And so that could be invoicing, for example. It could be the way that you'll be able to automate the invoicing that goes out. It means you haven't got to have somebody whose job it is to do that. It could be, for example, the emails that you send out. There's lots of ways you can automate things in a business so you can cut down the amount of time that you need to be able to do things, and it makes you incredibly efficient. You will be amazed at the number of big companies that you think are huge tech companies that have very, very few employees. And that is because they're very good at the automation part of things. They do things that they think, well, can I get effectively a robot or a computer program to do that for me? One thing that's often overlooked, and Justin is a ninja at this, is business plans and budgets. So if you have a business, you need to make a business plan. And people overlook it because I know we all get excited about what we're trying to do and achieve. But a business plan where you sit down and you write a plan of what you're going to do, so it forces you to look at how you're going to make money, how you're going to acquire customers, how much things are going to cost, look at overheads, whether you need to employ people. All of this stuff makes you look and validate what your business is and how it's going to work. And it's not just a plan for maybe if you want to go and get a loan. For you as an individual, it means you started to map out the plan that you can follow so you can just try to execute it. Part of it will be looking at the marketplace that you're in. But of course, in amongst all of that, you're going to have to look at budget. So how much you've got to spend on marketing. It makes you look at, well, do I need to spend money on marketing? How much do I? Do I need to print flyers for something? What's the most cost-effective way of marketing? And so by doing that, you go from being someone with an idea to somebody that has a plan. And if you have a plan, you are much more likely to succeed. It's not guaranteed, but it's why when you go for loans or if you want to try and get finance, people want to see a business plan. It means you've thought it through. If you do your business plan, it may mean that you pivot that business. It isn't going to work quite how you thought it would, but that is the beauty of doing it. You start on something that's got a greater chance of success. It's not just built on pure enthusiasm. And one of the things that it's a phrase that, again, Justin repeats over and over again. And if people wondering who Justin is, he's my twin brother, but he's also one of the other directors within Money to the Masses. And he's always banging on about things like revenue is vanity, profit is sanity, and cash flow is reality. And so when you see people, when you talk about revenue numbers in newspaper stories, that is just vanity. But the idea of profit is sanity. That will keep you sane, because at the end of the day, when you do something, whatever your business is, if you're not profitable, eventually you're going to go out of business. It doesn't matter if you're driving lots and lots of revenue. If you're not making any money at the end of the day, any profit, then you're inevitably going to run into trouble. And the cash flow is reality is that it's the cash flow that kills companies. It's the lack of cash flow. And if you look at companies, two of the biggest reasons companies fail is because they run out of cash, and it's often as well because they get a large tax bill that they can't afford to pay because they haven't managed their budgets properly and set money aside or done their accounting properly, which goes back to some of those earlier points that I mentioned. Because eventually the tax man always wants his money. If it ends up putting you under, he's not going to say, oh, don't worry about it. Eventually the tax man wants his money. So you see these companies, massive companies, who get a huge tax bill that they haven't paid that can end up sending them under. So cash flow is important. The other thing moving on is KPIs, so those key performance indicators. It sounds really boring, I know it does, but they are the levers which you can pull to make a business work. So when you have a key performance indicator, you need to be able to identify something that is measurable and that you can influence. So if you are somebody who produces something online, perhaps a KPI could be the number of people who visit your website, who read articles. That can be a KPI. It could be, if you depending on the business, it could be the visitor to customer ratio. So the conversion that happens from people actually going from being interested to actually buying something. All of these can be measurable. If something can be measured and you can influence it, that helps you measure your journey and your success along the way and how you can grow a business. Just saying you want to grow the business by 10%, that's a target. But that isn't a performance indicator, because how you're going to do that can be drilled down into very small things, and they're the KPIs that you need to look at. And that's why when you probably go to work, people talk about KPIs and you get bored of KPIs, but actually that increases your chances of being successful. If you know the key performance indicators, the key levers that you can pull that might influence your business and its profitability and cash flow, then you can try and make changes to them to try and eventually drive up revenue, profitability, and cash flow. The other thing is keep costs low. It sounds obvious, but you'd be amazed how many people get carried away with trying to go and buy the latest MacBook or the latest car, van for their new business. Keep costs low and always review them, because if you keep costs low, it's easier to make profit. Again, it sounds obvious, but it's so easy when you get into a business to get carried away with just forgetting a few quid here, a few quid there on some sort of subscription or service. They soon start to pile up, and that is your break even every month. All your costs to be profitable, reduce the cost, you increase your profitability. And actually, when you think about it, if your business, one measure of its value will be based upon its profitability. And it's why when companies buy other companies, they go in and start to cut costs to increase the profitability, which increase the value of a company. And the final one I want to mention is buy from cash flow, people will get excited about trying to buy things and they'll take out loans. And there are times where you have to do that. That's a given. But it's far better to buy from cash flow, which means buying from money that you actually have. So you might want to be able to buy a new van. It's better to buy that from cash that you have rather than taking out loans for that, because then you've got a loan that you've got to service and those start to stack up and they have interest. So if you buy from cash flow, then it means that you're less likely to run out of cash flow. You become mindful of it. And so taking all of those 10 into the round, there are plenty of others that people can share from their experience. But those are the things that for what we've done over the 11 years, they've had material impacts in the ability for us to be able to still be here. So they increase your chances of success, but they don't guarantee it.
Good stuff. So moving on, Damien, I'm going to take this piece and we're going to briefly talk about Nest. And Nest Pensions, what is it? Well, first of all, it stands for the National Employment Savings Trust, and it's a pension provider that was set up by the government as a part of the Pensions Act 2008. Essentially, the government, as part of its pension reforms, wanted to make sure that people who are in work had access to a pension. So fast forward a couple of years, and in 2010, Nest was set up, and it's a way that employers can easily set up a pension for their employees. Now, what's quite attractive from the employer's point of view is it's completely free. There's no charges at present for employers to administrate their company schemes through the Nest pension scheme. Okay, so it's worth pointing out exactly who can have a Nest pension. You have to be one of three people. You either have to be auto-enrolled by your employer. Alternatively, you can be self-employed and have a Nest pension. We'll cover that in more detail later on, but that is something that's available for the self-employed. And the other way that you can get a Nest pension is if you have received a divorce settlement as part of a pension sharing order. So if your ex-spouse or ex-civil partner had a Nest pension and you've been awarded some of that pension, you will be invited to join a pension scheme with Nest, and you can carry on contributing to that part of the pension, or you can transfer it elsewhere if you wish. So it's important to note that you can't just open a Nest pension. It needs to be one of those three things: through auto-enrolment, if you're a self-employed person, or if you've received a divorce settlement. So moving on, employees themselves will need to be auto-enrolled. And again, this is part of this government push to get people saving into pensions. You need to be at least 22 years old, first of all. You need to be under the state pension age, and you need to be earning at least £10,000 per year through your employer. If all of those are ticked, then if you're in employment, you will be auto-enrolled. It won't necessarily be in the Nest scheme. I'm focusing on the Nest scheme today. There are other schemes available, but it certainly is the most popular scheme.
So it's interesting that we're doing this piece because, ironically, the most listeners to our podcast actually will have a Nest pension, yet no one talks about it. I mean, I'm amazed how many people don't talk about Nest or don't know much about it, given that it is such a big pension scheme. And like I say, most people probably listen to this podcast. It's the most common pension that they will have.
Yeah, and the reason we're kind of highlighting it today is almost as a piece to give people a bit of peace of mind, really. The focus of this is to really say, I just want to put it out there, Nest is good, it's decent, it's okay. You get a choice of a number of funds you can invest in. When you're auto-enrolled into Nest, you'll be enrolled into a retirement date fund, which is a lifestyling fund that will sort of match your age and change the balance of that portfolio as you get older. But also you've got a choice of 6 other funds you can invest in, 2 of which are specifically tailored for those who are approaching retirement. So you can see that the government's thought about this. Another thing that's interesting is they don't use asset managers. They actually employ their own team of in-house managers. And the way that Nest put it on their website is they're also Nest members themselves. So it's a bit of a corny bit of advertising, but what they're saying is they're self-invested to make sure that they're doing the right thing for you. But it's quite interesting that they've got their own team of people. In terms of cost, they're pretty good value. They only charge 0.3% as an annual management charge. Now, what is slightly different about Nest, and it's worth pointing out, is they charge a contribution fee. It's 1.8%. So every time you contribute, and you will generally contribute through your employer, Obviously, you can top up, but every time you put money into that, you're going to be charged 1.8% of the amount that's going in. It sounds quite a lot, but actually, when you pull the numbers together, and we've done an article which will be going live on the website in the next few days, you can see side by side that it compares very well with the cheapest of the pensions out there. So you can be rest assured you're not going to be charged over the odds.
Yeah, because it's quite an unusual charging structure in a way, because now the world's moved on that we don't tend to have charges on the way in on most pensions, some of the bigger ones I'm talking about. But obviously their back end charges are much higher. So like you were talking about a charge of only 0.3, then on the back end you could have a platform charge and a fund charge when it's all totaled up will be north of 1%. So I can see how the balance can occur, but it's interesting. Is there an ethical option?
There is. And what's interesting is the ethical option costs exactly the same as the non-ethical option. So other providers, they will generally charge you slightly more for ethical funds, whereas on this one, they don't. So, it swings and roundabouts in terms of the cost.
That's quite a good sell point now, Andy, in a way, because you're right that most providers, their differential between the ethical and non-ethical is quite a bit. So I'd give you an example. Broadly, sticking the finger in the air, you could get, say, a non-ethical investment would be maybe 0.8 if we're talking about some of the sort of robo-advice companies out there. But if you get the ethical version of it, you could add probably another 0.1, 0.2 at least on top of that cost. And sometimes it can be more just because of the nature of trying to own those investments in an active way. So it is interesting. If you're an ethical investor, key things investing for the long term is keep costs low, but it's quite interesting for an ethical investor. You can invest at the same price. Obviously, you're going to have to look and see what they invested in if you're happy with it.
Yeah.
But sorry, Andy, I interrupted. Carry on.
Yeah, there's a couple of key points that I just wanted to mention before I talk about whether you can take your pot with you and changing jobs and things like that. If you're self-employed, don't think that this isn't for you. Nest allows you to contribute if you're self-employed. You just apply through the website, say that you're self-employed, and you can start contributing. The only thing to remember about that is there is a minimum contribution of £10, which I think is fair enough because they've got to do the administration side of things.
Is that £10 a month, Andy?
That's £10 per contribution. So if you were going to be doing it daily or weekly or monthly, it's got to be at least £10. You've got to hit that limit for them to accept that contribution. You don't have to set up a regular contribution. You could do it yearly if you wanted. You can do it ad hoc. It's quite flexible.
Gotcha.
Where Nest does become a little bit confusing is to do with the changing of jobs. Now, this isn't a new thing. This has existed since pensions were conceived. People moving companies and having various different pots all over the place. With Nest, it's actually not too bad because, as I say, it's the UK's largest pension provider. And so when you move jobs, there is a high possibility that the employer that you move to will actually have a Nest pension. So let's look at that scenario. You already have a Nest pension, you move to a new job, and as luck would have it, they use Nest as well. What will happen is you will be automatically enrolled. The system is there to do that for you, and you'll receive a welcome pack. Now, in that welcome pack, there'll be a form in there that says, "Welcome to Nest. Can you let us know, are you already a member?" And then if you are, you fill in that form and you send proof of identification. They will then marry the records up to say, okay, you've moved from there to there, and then you can carry on contributing into the same pot. So that's brilliant. Often what happens when you move jobs is you'll have a pot over there, a pot over here. And in terms of compounding and interest, it's a nightmare because you're not making full use of it. Whereas with Nest, if you move from employer to employer, you can keep topping up the same pot, which is really good. Another scenario is you had a Nest pension, you've moved to a new employer and they don't use Nest. In that case, then your pot will kind of stay as it was, but it will still remain active. And there's nothing stopping you adding and contributing to that ad hoc. You can do that if you like. You can also, if you want to, move that pension pot over to your new pension provider or to one of your choice, personal pension, a SIP or whatever. So you have a few choices if you move. You could also convince your new employer to use Nest. That might be an option for you. If you were previously employed and had a Nest pension, but are now self-employed, super easy. You literally go online to Nest and you click a few buttons to say you'd like to convert your employed Nest pot to a self-employed pot, and then you can carry on contributing, no problems at all. And the last option of that is if you were previously self-employed and had opened your own Nest pension and you then move to an employer where you're now employed and they use Nest. It's the same process of moving employer to employer within Nest. You'll get the welcome pack. You fill in the welcome pack with the proof of ID and they'll effectively convert your self-employed pension pot over to your employed pension pot and off you go, carry on. I have to be honest, from researching this Nest, I thought it was going to be confusing because of what I heard. But when I've delved into it, it's actually fairly straightforward. So it's nice to be able to dispel some of the myths and get the information out there.
So I hope the takeaway from that for people is that Nest is a viable option. The key thing is about contributing to a pension over the long term, keeping costs low. We're not talking about performance or anything here, but it's about being involved in a pension, and it ticks a number of boxes like I've said or Andy has said. And of course, auto-enrolment, you can opt out, but I would question why people would want to, obviously if they can't afford it. But if you take advantage of auto-enrolment, then there is free money effectively on the table from your employer. So there we go, there's Nest. Andy's going to publish the full article and analysis, and so you can look at it in more detail next week on the website, so you can have a look. But if you've got a Nest pension, then hopefully you've taken a bit of comfort from that piece and you understand a bit more of what is going on with your pension.
Yeah, and that's it, Damien. And just before we finish, if anyone out there's got a Nest pension, I've got a Nest pension from previous employment, I would recommend that you go online, find your login details and have a look online, because the dashboard that they've created on there is far more user-friendly. I used it a couple of years ago and thought, goodness me, this is really confusing. I don't understand what it is. There's a really, really simple dashboard now that you can see how much you're investing, how much your employer has invested, how much you're getting from tax relief, how much the actual pot itself is making in terms of the investments themselves. So go and do that, log in. And actually, once you're in, it's a few clicks of a button and you can change the pension funds that you're invested in should you require. So yeah, do that.
So there you go. Everyone's got a task. If they think they've got a Nest pension, go to nestpensions.org.uk and you can then log in and look at your pension.
Okay, so let's move on then. You're going to be talking about, Damien, margin of error.
Yeah, this was something that I touched upon very briefly and promised I'd come back to when I spoke to Lauren the other week on the podcast when she was talking about debt. Now, the concept of margin of error helps increase the chances of success in any financial plan that you have. So let's say, for example, somebody has become very astute with their money. They may have done their budgeting. They know how they're spending their money. They've done the money MOT, for example, got all their ducks lined up in a row. And that will give them a great sense of confidence. They'll feel better about life. Obviously, when you start to control your money and you build a plan, the likelihood of you sticking to a plan, let's say as part of that plan, you had decided that you were going to contribute to some investments or put some money away or build up a cash buffer. The importance of succeeding and actually seeing that you're making headway is incredibly important. And it can be really demoralizing when you build a plan and it falls apart because something goes wrong. So there's an unexpected change in one of the variables that you've basically built into this plan. And the idea of a margin of error is to give you the buffer whereby that it allows for a wiggle room, a bit of flexibility in your plan. So a very simple one would be if you are budgeting and you worked out that your budget for food was maybe £620 a month on average over a period of time, you'd use the budgeting app, it told you that, then the best thing to do is create a margin of error. So you may maybe round that up to £650 or whatever the buffer you want to have. So it allows for that margin of error, that flexibility. You might overspend 1 month or underspend another. And what that means is that each month you're more likely to stick to your budget. I know you are a real stickler for round numbers, Andy. Even when it comes to watching sport, Andy almost would be betting against Watford just for somebody can complete their hat trick. He likes the round numbers, don't you, Andy? And
I do.
I'm kind of the same, but that's why when you're budgeting, if you can, I get the fact that some people, the budgeting will be much tighter, but if you can, give yourself a margin of error, because then you won't have to keep changing your budget. You're more likely to be able to stick to it. So therefore, at the end of the month, you might have some money left over, which you can then sweep into savings. Maybe it's a cash buffer, but it's not just about debt or clearing debt. If you are planning to retire and you're trying to build a pension pot, there are a lot of assumptions on the size of pension pot that you may need. So I know that in the FI space, the financial independence space, they bang on about the 25 times annual income. So that's the size of pot that you'd probably need. So if you wanted $4,000 a year, then you would need 100 grand in an investment to be able to produce that, assuming it's going to grow. But a lot of that is based upon assumptions of what is sustainable, what is likely in the investment world, how much return you're going to get. So in that scenario, the margin of error would be to reduce the level of the assumed withdrawal rate that you would have. So maybe you would use 3%. And if you go back, we did do an episode on the podcast about debunking the 4% rule. Actually, it was the level of the sustainable withdrawal on a pension was lower than 4. I think it was nearer sort of 3. So give yourself a margin of error. It will mean that you'll probably have to contribute more to your pension over time, but that margin of error is almost like you plan for the worst but hope for the best, and if you get the best outcome, then that margin of error is almost like a positive. So always look for the margin of error. Again, it's talking about businesses, starting a business, the cost when you're building your business plan. Give yourself a margin of error, because if things are too tight and then they expand, that's when the problems happen. So to use a real life example, I'm no DIY man by any means. In fact, my wife will regularly tell people I'm useless at it, which I think is a little bit unfair. But if you lay laminated flooring, there's something called an expansion gap that you have to leave around the outside to allow for the fact that laminated floor can expand. If you go right up to the walls, what will happen is the floor will, when it expands inevitably, most likely due to humidity, it will start to buckle. That is the same concept with the margin of error in money, and it occurs throughout nearly every part of your finances. Even if you're taking out maybe insurances, you take out insurance, you might have a margin of error in the insurance policy that you take out for the lump sum that you might require, because things might change. You might take out a life insurance policy that's going to pay out an amount that at this point in time that you predict will be sufficient for your partner, spouse to be able to survive, etc. But you might want to leave a margin of error in that so that things could change and you don't have to keep taking out new policy. So the margin of error, always bear in mind the margin of error. And the other reason that it's important, it's not just because it increases your chances of your success when having a financial plan and sticking to it to achieve what you want, or indeed make it more robust in life, but it reduces anxiety because it allows you to have that flexibility. Because when you try and control things so tightly, that's when you can become anxious. You know you've got this ability to expand, this wiggle room. So there we go, Andy. We're done for this week.
Indeed we are. If you want to get in touch with Damien, you can do so. It's Damien at moneytothemasses.com. Twitter, it's at moneytothemasses with the number 2. Don't forget, we've got the Facebook group as always. It's facebook.com/groups/money to the masses. Get involved over there.
And of course, please do leave us a review if you can. It is not only motivating to Andy and I and the rest of the team, but it also helps move us up those charts. So do leave a review on whichever platform you use to listen to the podcast. So until next week, Andy.
Until next time.